On today's Film and Whiskey, we are talking with Filmland Spirits, a new whiskey company that's just come out with 3 fantastic whiskeys. And if you can't tell, they approach topics that we might care just a little bit about. That's all ahead on Film and Whiskey. Hey everybody, welcome into the Film and Whiskey podcast. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we are coming at you with another special bonus episode.
Bonus episode.
Brad, I'm really excited to share the interview today with our listeners because, I mean, what can you say?
Dude, this is just the epitome of what we have been trying to do for these last 3.5 years. Talk about movies and whiskey. They took it one step further, and they've worked in the movie industry and make their own whiskey now. And I just think that this is, I don't know, man. Actually, they've kind of done everything we want to do. So
yeah, it's kind of
just hang up the old, hang it up and be done.
I was going to say either we should hang it up or we should just take it as a glimpse into our own future. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, we've always talked about starting our own film company, so.
Yeah, just throw whiskey in on top of it, man. Well, hey, I don't want to vamp any longer. This is a really good conversation, so let's get right into it. We're going to be talking with Troy and Charlie from Filmland Spirits, and without further ado, here's the interview. All right, everybody, we are joined today by 2 people who I have been waiting months and months to talk to. Brad, I'll give the backstory in just a minute, but suffice it to say, we're speaking with a brand today, and I don't know if we will ever again speak to a brand that is more aligned with the goals of our podcast than Filmland Spirits.
Yeah, Bob, the spirits themselves have just like lined up perfectly. And this is a company that really loves movies and really loves whiskey. And I don't know if I've ever heard of anybody else who feels that way about things.
Yeah, so I mean, we got them on the show specifically so I could look them in the eye and say, what the hell are you doing? This is our turf. Like, back off a little bit here. But we're joined today by Troy Bolotnick, who is the founder and CEO of Filmland Spirits, and Charlie Flint, who is the VP of Operations. Gentlemen, welcome into Film and Whiskey.
Thank you very much. Super happy to be here.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. We appreciate it.
All right, so let me give a little bit of backstory. About 6 months ago, I'm on Instagram, and there is a very helpful account on Instagram that just kind of monitors new submissions to the TTB. Every time a new whiskey label is created, they take a screenshot, they share it with the world. And I saw that there's a brand that's coming out called Filmland Spirits, and that they have this cool retro-looking bottle design that looks like an old sci-fi movie poster. And I immediately tried to find you guys on Instagram. I said, let's get you on the show. And whoever was running your account at the time was like, yes, let's do that. Also, we don't actually launch for like 6 months. And so this has been a long time in the making, but give us a little bit of a backstory of the brand itself. How did Filmland Spirits come to be?
Sure. Absolutely. And thank you. It's been a lot more than 6 months for us, actually. But
that's true.
You mean it takes longer than 6 months to get a distillery off the ground?
Oh my gosh, yes. So, think about it. It's a lot like making a movie, right? A lot of parallels. So I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. But I mean, Charlie and I have been friends for almost 30 years and have worked together in various capacities in the entertainment business, in related businesses and non-related businesses. And we're both writers. We're both creatives. We both worked in the entertainment industry. And I don't know, somewhere 10 years ago, maybe, because Charlie now lives in Atlanta. I live in LA. We both sort of together and separately got into whiskey and got into bourbon. And, we just, our friendship went to the next level when we realized we were both into it, and our geekiness and nerdiness went to the next level. And we started visiting distilleries. We would make an annual pilgrimage to Kentucky, right? The motherland, and started visiting distilleries there. And on one of our annual trips, we were just driving between Lexington and Louisville, as we often would do, and said, we got to do our own brand. We got to do a distillery or a brand or something. We got to do this. We can do this.
I was going to say, the classic story, though, is like sitting at the bar about 5-6 drinks in and being like, hey, we should we're open our own bar.
Right, exactly. Oh, we've had that conversation. We've had that conversation in Atlanta, in LA, in China, everywhere.
Yeah, there's a lot of places I plan to open a bar.
Right.
And stock it with your own spirits.
100%.
Well, guys, tell us a little bit about your history with the film industry, because that, I'm really curious. We talk to all these distillery owners, and we get the whiskey spiel over and over, and I'm excited to hear about your whiskey. But to start here, I am really fascinated with what you guys did in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I came out to Los Angeles from New York 30 years ago to be a writer, to be a screenwriter specifically. That is what I've wanted to do since I can remember wanting to do anything, since 5 or 6 years old. And it was an interesting journey. I wrote some movies. I wrote a lot of different things. I did just about every job there is to do on one level or another in the entertainment industry, because I started as a production assistant and worked as an associate and line producing and a little bit of directing and a lot of writing. So did it all in that regard. And then, one day just said, I love writing and I love the movies, but I'm not like the biggest fan of the movie business itself. Had some crazy experiences, which one day we should make a movie out of, and just, took my passions elsewhere and became a serial entrepreneur.
Yeah. And in my case, I actually, I didn't move to LA intending to write or necessarily even be in the entertainment industry. I actually moved there because Troy had created, in the mid 90s, Troy co-created one of the first pieces of entertainment on the internet. It was a website called The Spot. It was essentially, Melrose Place on the internet back when nobody was doing entertainment on the internet. And I'd become a fan, and I was working for a college in the Midwest in Indiana. And as a way of kind of stretching my creative skills and also learning HTML, I effectively created a website and wrote myself into their storyline. And he and his then partner called me up and were like, move to LA and come work with us and do more of this. And I assumed that it was just a bunch of sketchy dudes in a garage in Culver City, California. But they flew me out, and they were in fact just a bunch of sketchy dudes in a garage in Culver City, California. But I took the leap and I moved out. And then, so along the way, Troy and I have written together. Troy and I have written, I've written with other writing partners and have written individually. Obviously, I live in Atlanta, like Troy mentioned earlier. So clearly not the most successful screenwriter of all time. I did manage to sell a few things on my own, and Troy and I have I think we sold a TV series treatment together. None of it great that I did, at least, and none of it ever came to it never became a full-time career. So I moved on with my life, and now get to go back and kind of revisit that side of my personal history, in this different form, in the form of a spirit that celebrates the movies and allows us to go back and do some of the writing and be creative the way that we were in the past, and develop screenplays, but not necessarily for the big screen, instead for a big exciting bottle.
So guys, we just got back over the weekend from the Kentucky Bourbon Festival, which happens every year in Bardstown, Kentucky. And we had a booth there, and we were interacting with the public a lot. And a lot of people kind of kept asking us, why movies and whiskey? Like, how did you hit on this topic? And I guess for me, because I'm such a movie nerd, it was like, well, this just gives me an outlet to talk about things that I'm already talking about, and I get to drink whiskey while I do it. But I've been trying to think of, how to wax poetic about it. And I think I have some ideas, but I want to pose the question to you guys first. When you think about these two passions of yours, movies and whiskey, like, where do you see the intersection there? What are the commonalities, and why do those things marry so well together?
Well, I think, from the standpoint of making both, right? When I think about it, they both require the same fundamentals, right? You said passion. Mm-hmm. Art, science, creativity, right? There are two things I always used to say when I was in the entertainment business. Like, I love the science of it, but I also love the art of it. Mm-hmm. And I say the same thing about whiskey. When Charlie and I were visiting all those distilleries, it's like, love tasting it, love just the fact that two people can use the exact same process and end up with something that tastes completely different. Mm-hmm. And yet there's also science in there. And I think, we always say one of our little lines for Filmland is, we craft with whiskey with a movie making mindset. And that's really where it comes from is the approach is the same as those sort of four fundamental pillars of passion, art, science, and creativity.
Yeah, I would agree. And like Troy said, we've talked about it a lot. I would say another thing is just community, right? There are a lot of hobbies or industries that people get very passionate about, but spirits, whiskey in particular, bourbon in particular, and films are two of the ones that, personally, I've gotten the most involved in, but I find people that are super passionate about them, right? Like, I don't know certainly there are people who have, rooms and rooms full of Beanie Babies or whatever, but not nearly as many as there are with rooms and rooms full of whiskey. I know people who have massive bourbon collections, and I'm sure you guys do too. Mm-hmm. I know people who have massive film collections. And often they're the same people, and it's just, I think that they're two, they're two topics that people can get really passionate, very opinionated about. There's the movie that Troy loves, I might not love as much, Logan's Run. There could be whiskeys that Troy loves that I might not love as much. Everybody perceives both of these things, both of these arts differently. And I think that's part of what makes it really cool. Bringing the two together is exactly that, right? Like, it gave us an opportunity to geek out in creating, creative concepts that we thought would be really interesting. But at the same time, it also gave us a chance to geek out creating, taste profiles and products that we think taste really great as well.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I've been thinking about this question for the last couple of days too, and I really think that when you look at the history of movies and you look at some of the earliest films ever made, that classic short film of the train pulling into the station, and then if you watch Scorsese's Hugo, he shows how people were leaping out of their seats, right, because they thought the train was going to come through the screen, and movies were something for the people and of the people. When they first started, they have always been something that has appealed to the masses, to the poorest of the poor people. And yet immediately you see guys like Méliès come in France and start applying art to that and saying, like, I'm going to make a trip to the moon and it's going to have these crazy special effects and we're going to try double exposures and whatever. And whiskey's the same way. Like, whiskey started in areas of the world and is still famous for Scotland, like historically oppressed, right? And Kentucky, like they were poor people in the hills that shared this thing with each other. And there's just something about how movies and whiskey can be the pinnacle of artistry and can also be something that is just for the people. And I think that there's very few things in the world that can really cover that span as well as both of those things can.
I think that's very, very nicely put. I think that's a fantastic perspective.
Well, thanks. I've been practicing it for like 3 days. So.
as you were saying it, I was thinking to myself, and both are fantastic, means of escapism, right? Like if you've had a terrible day at work, go home, put on a great movie and just kind of let the world go away. If you do it with a glass of a great bourbon in your hand, I guess it goes even further.
Well, let's do that. Let's pivot a little bit into talking about the whiskey that you guys are making. Brad, I'm going to throw over to you because I know that you were the one that really wanted to ask a lot of questions about the whiskey itself.
I mean, first off, whoever your marketing team is, Rise of the Robots and Moonlight Escape, I believe it is.
Moonlight Mayhem.
Moonlight Mayhem, I apologize, are two of the best, labels for whiskey that I've ever heard of. Tell me about your guys' initial lineup, because I'm seeing a rye, a bourbon, and a cask strength bourbon. But we can forget about that for a second. You guys have the coolest labels in the world, and I want you to tell me all about them.
Sure, absolutely. And that was sort of what, in a way, what we set out to do. Like when we were conceiving Filmland and this concept, we knew we wanted labels that stood out. We knew we wanted labels that we could be ourselves and express our humor and our sarcasm and, just sort of sometimes silliness and sometimes seriousness. And so we had that framework. And then it came down to one of our co-founders, I was sitting with him, and we had been banging our heads against the wall as to what the concept should be for months. And we were at that point where it's like, nothing's going to work. Everything's done. Everybody did it. It's trademark. We can't do it. And then all of a sudden, and he's a podcast host, and he started interviewing me, and he started asking me what I'm passionate about. And I started talking about writing and the movies. And he said to me, Troy, I've never heard you talk this passionately about anything else except whiskey. And we're looking at each other like, oh, we should put those together. And that's kind of where it came from. And like 6 seconds later, Rise of the Robots blurted out of my mouth. It was because it was actually originally had a longer name, because I thought we wanted to do it, these are meant to pay homage to the B movies of the mid 20th century.
Yep.
Right. Big over the top plots and characters, monsters, robots, aliens, that kind of thing. And those movies tend to have, like Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. They have a rhythm to the titles. So originally, I envisioned it was going to be Rise of the Robot Bartenders. And then for reasons of fitting on the label and some other reasons, we shortened it to Rise of the Robots, which everybody seems to like better anyway. But so one thing I wanted to sort of say is that a lot of people in the process, they kind of ask us questions about like, well, is it based on, is Rise of the Robots based on a movie? Is it based on it? And I have this like weird concept that's hard to get across, that in my mind, there is no difference between the liquid and the movie. They're one. Right. And so like people say, like, there's a story of the liquid, and the liquid is the story, and that kind of thing. It's all together. I'll find a more eloquent way of putting that. But in my mind, they're all one. So we came up with this idea of Rise of the Robots, right? And our heroine, Courtney. And then we went and we found liquid, obviously we source, and we found liquid that we loved. And then Charlie and I, along with a couple of other members of our team, went to Kentucky and started blending, and started, we have a whole bunch of barrels, and we started sampling them and blending them together until we found a blend that is exactly what we wanted, we were aiming for, and got it into this particular product. And then we did the same thing with the bourbon. Moonlight Mayhem is the story of where it's basically Romeo and Juliet with fangs, is what we always say. And it's a world where the dominant species on the planet are werewolves, and humans are like the minority. Like every type of human is just minority, shoved off to the side, has to serve the werewolves, that kind of thing. And of course, this young kid just loves the nightlife where the werewolves all hang out on Hollywood Boulevard, and he falls in love with the beautiful young woman whose older brother is the leader of the pack, that kind of thing. And so we did the same process, tasting. I mean, we had days where we tasted 50 different barrels over the course of 3 or 4 days. Right. And just found that taste profile that we wanted, because we're both very particular about our whiskey, and we both like certain things. And we said, let's make sure that what we make has everything that we both like in it.
I think it's really apparent how much thought has been put into each of these bottles of whiskey. And like you're saying now, there's a whole treatment for a movie behind each of these. And go ahead. No, I can see you're going to.
I was going to say we wrote treatment for each of them. So we have a 3 or 4 page treatment, which we wrote before we ever did the label. So when we started working with artists, we gave them the treatment. We said, here, you got to read this. And then we took them through the movie to help them, and we gave them the vision for what we wanted on the label, what we wanted the poster to be. But we make sure everybody that we work with reads those treatments and understands the story. Because like I said, the story is the liquid is the story.
That's incredible. I mean, and I think it carries over too into the actual bottle, not just the label. Because the label, you guys have, your names and the proof and everything kind of printed on there, like credits would be printed on a poster. But when you look at the bottle itself, and I have to ask about the bottles, like, were these custom made for you guys? Did you just find something that kind of looked like it could be spun into this? Because it's hard to describe to the listeners, but there's like the rim around the outside of the bottle looks like sprockets on a film reel. And it's just incredible. It's like, I keep finding little Easter eggs on this bottle that just show the care and the love that you guys have for cinema on here.
Yeah. I mean, so the bottles are completely custom, from scratch.
Wow.
They're ours. There's nothing else out there like it. And they are meant, they're both inspired by and meant to evoke sort of like the Art Deco style of 1930s movie theaters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if you think about it, the way I always think about it is the bottle itself is the theater. It's the proscenium, right? And then the poster is the movie within it. And so that's what it's really meant to do is the bottle represents that we are serious about everything we're doing, right? We're serious about the whiskey. We're serious about this brand. We're serious about quality and taste and all of that, because our labels are meant to say, we love to make fun of ourselves and everybody else and have a great time.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's meant to be a combination of that. But the base of the bottle is a kinetoscope, like the Edison kinetoscope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's so, you know what I'm talking about, where the original movie you mentioned before, like the horse running in circles.
Yep.
And then our closure is actually sort of a combination between a film reel and a film can. So when you look at it from the side, it's kind of a film reel, but when you look at it from the top, it's a bit of a film can.
Yeah, I love it. Charlie, I want to ask you too. You know, Troy's been talking about the inspiration being kind of these Art Deco movie theaters or, you know, movie palaces. Did you guys have one of those movie theaters in your lives when you were kids? Because, you know, Brad and I are from Northeast Ohio, and one of the cool things here is, you know, we have the multiplexes, but there are still a number of these really great old movie theaters. We have one down in Canton, Ohio, and there's also one here in Akron, the Civic Theater, and they're the ones that have like the nighttime sky at the top of the theater with the little stars in it. And I don't know. I'd love to hear about like what was your theater like that when you were both growing up.
Yeah, well, you mentioning that immediately evokes in my head one of the most classic, beautiful, you know, old style theaters, and it's there in LA. It's the Egyptian, which is an absolutely gorgeous theater. If you're ever in LA and you haven't been, I highly recommend it. Still has the organ. They you know, they have the lights and all of that on the ceiling. Myself, I grew up. I'm an Army brat, so I grew up moving all over the world. And usually on the Army base, there would be a movie theater, and it was kind of, you know, the movie theater wasn't elaborate like that. It was also used for, you know, like assemblies and briefings and things like that. And there was no such thing as a multiplex. You know, you got to watch whatever was showing at that time. And it was usually a couple of years behind what was, especially abroad, it was a couple of years behind what was showing in the US. So, you know, like, we didn't exactly get to see the new stuff. But what I always remember when somebody asked me to kind of reflect on like going to the movies as a kid is that before the movie would actually play in a military movie theater, they probably still do it today, the national anthem plays almost like at a sporting event. You have to stand up and put your hand on your heart and you know, like wait for the national anthem to end, and then it's play ball and the movie starts. So as a kid, I never really got to experience some of these classic theaters really until I moved to LA. And like I said, the Egyptian to me is the epitome of like the classic, beautiful, you know, grand, you know, like Art Deco style movie theater, complete with, you know, with organs and the lights and all of that, like you described.
So first of all, Charlie and I have known each other, like I said, almost 30 years, and he just said something I've never heard him say before. So thank you guys. That's hard to do because we've spent a lot of time together. For me, it wasn't necessarily growing up, because I have vague memories of like a theater called the Gables on like the main street. I grew up on Long Island in New York. And, but I don't remember it being particularly ornate. It was when I moved to California, that I was suddenly going to, you know, I don't know what it's called anymore. It used to be called Mann's. And then there's the El Capitan. These are like the Hollywood Boulevard theaters. Mm-hmm. But then I moved to Westwood, which had more movie theaters per capita than any other city or town in the entire country. And I was walking distance to all of them and did nothing but go to the movies like constantly. And a theater, I mean, maybe a block and a half from my house, I think it was called the Pacific. And Disney at one point bought it and actually owned it. And it is exactly what you guys are describing. You go in, it's all Art Deco. It's colorful. Like the whole proscenium is exactly what we're all picturing. And then the movie starts and the experience starts and the music plays and everybody looks up at the star-filled sky and just sits there and waits for that comet to go across the sky to kind of shoot across in the light. And it like made the experience. So I think that's the theater that I always keep in my head. And then a previous business that I did, one of my entrepreneurial efforts was actually designing and building movie theaters for high-end residential homes here in Los Angeles. And so we would design theaters that looked like that had a very Art Deco style, that had the Starfield ceiling and that kind of thing.
Guys, how great are movies? This is just like, I'm just grinning from ear to ear over here. And before we let you go, we were floated a name, and Charlie, you've already dropped this name here. We usually call this series My Favorite Movie, but it sounds like in true film and whiskey fashion, there's actually a bit of contentiousness about this favorite movie. So I think it's Troy's favorite movie. So Troy, why don't you introduce us to your favorite film?
Okay, well, to be fair, I think Charlie and you guys are referring to Logan's Run. I would not say Logan's Run is my favorite film. Logan's Run is the first film I ever saw in the theater when I was 6 years old.
Wow.
So at least the first one I remember seeing, but I have vivid memories of seeing it. And it made me want to be a writer because it terrified the heck out of me and delighted, made me crazy excited at the same time. It was so scary to think, oh my gosh, you have to die when you're 30 and you're going to get exploded in this carousel thing. And it just terrified me. And I had nightmares about it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Right. So I would not call that my favorite film. I haven't.
Hang on, before you go any further, I got to point out, I just rewatched this movie in advance of this conversation because I haven't seen it in probably decades. And that's a wildly inappropriate movie for a 6-year-old. I'm horrified that that's what you were seeing at the age of 6.
I rewatched it as well with my girlfriend who had never seen it. And she was like, who took you to see this when you were 6?
I was going to say, this sounds like an origin story where Batman is terrified of the bats in the opera and Troy is terrified of the getting blown up in a carousel.
Right, exactly. But to be fair, the movie was rated PG, and back then there was no PG-13. So parents
There's a lot of nudity in that movie for a PG movie. Jeez.
The 70s were a wild time.
But
Brad, on that point, Brad, there is this subgenre of 70s dystopian sci-fi movies that were also huge hits. We talk people always talk about how Blade Runner, comes out in 82 and doesn't do well theatrically. But in the 70s, you've got movies like Logan's Run. You've got Charlton Heston in Soylent Green. I think about all these movies and it's what were people looking for in the 70s that this was the populist entertainment? You know what I mean? And Brad, we've done this series of 70s movies and how the cynicism was running deep in general. But especially in the sci-fi movies, it seems like this kind of thing just kept coming out.
Well, even in the decade before, one of the most famous movies of all time is Planet of the Apes.
Sure.
Right? And it's this super cynical look at humanity and what we're going to do to ourselves. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I'm kind of curious. What was going on in the 60s and 70s? I don't think there was any problems in America at that time.
Yeah. If there's one thing they say about the 60s and 70s, it's that nothing ever went wrong, right? All right, Charlie, I got to hear it from you. Troy picked a movie. You got to say something before we let you guys out of here today.
So you guys are gonna laugh. I think Troy knows what my all-time favorite movie is, and whenever I say it, people are usually kind of surprised. So it is literally as polar opposite of a film as you can possibly get from these dystopian, late 60s and 70s era movies. I'm a big fan of George Miller and Babe. Yes, the talking pig movie, not the baseball player movie. Babe is my all-time favorite movie. I've watched it more times than I can tell you. I've watched it on my own. I've watched it with my kids. I've watched it in the theater. I cry every friggin' time. I think it's the perfect movie. It's full of hope and it tells a great story of acceptance and it's very well directed. The sequel was trash, but the original Babe by George Miller is my all-time favorite movie. Absolutely.
My wife is notoriously bad at memorizing or remembering movie lines. But for some reason, the one thing that stuck, and she said, she's I haven't even watched Babe a ton as a kid, but she always remembers the Ba Ram You line. I mean, it's just ingrained in her consciousness.
So actually, this brings up a total tangential, quick mini story. But one of the companies that Troy and I worked at eons ago was starting up an entertainment division for America Online. And I was a producer. I was behind the scenes, but I had kind of been criticizing some of the on-air talent. And so they're like, all right, Charlie, next interview you're going to do because you keep running your mouth so much. And oh my God, I'm blanking. How can I do this? I'm James Cromwell, who played the farmer in Babe, was the next talent that came in. And so they had me go and interview him. And the reason this is relevant is it was my very first interview, much like this is our very first podcast with this brand. And he was an extremely good sport. It was a great interview. He's kind of a nutty guy who, like believes in UFOs and, like got off on all these super fun tangents. But anyways, at the end, I said to him, so this was my first interview. How did it go? And of course, he graced me by saying, "That'll do, Charlie. That'll do."
Oh,
that's awesome.
I could probably get weepy just thinking about it right now if I try.
Oh man. Listen, for a guy that is like a words of affirmation guy, Charlie, I feel that. To have James Cromwell tell you that'll do. Well, guys, I mean, it doesn't mean as much coming from us as it does from James Cromwell, but having tasted this whiskey, having talked to you about the brand, and having seen the passion that you've put into this, I think Brad and I would both say that'll do to both of you as well. Something tells me this is not going to be our last conversation. It's really rare that we get someone on the podcast that is this passionate about both of the things that we love on here. So you guys have an open invitation. Come back whenever you'd like. Help us guest host. We can look at Logan's run and just invite Charlie, and we can just trash it if we want to. So.
That's great, awesome. We would love to come back. You guys are awesome. This has been great.
Awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Big fans. I've been a listener for a while, so it's actually a real privilege to join you guys and meet you in person.
Well, thanks again. This has been Troy Bolotnick and Charlie Flint from Filmland Spirits. Be on the lookout for this whiskey. It is fantastic stuff, and it is film and whiskey approved for sure. We'll be back on Monday with another regularly scheduled episode. But until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.